In the year 1587, 117 English men, women, and children built a settlement on a sandy island off the coast of what we now call North Carolina. 3 years later, a ship came back for them, and they were gone. But they hadn't fled. They had pulled their own houses down, board by board, and carried them away. They had raised a tall wooden wall around the bare ground where the settlement once stood. And on a post beside the entrance, cut deep into the wood, they had left a single word: Croatoan. You have probably heard this story before, or at least a version of it. A whole colony that vanished without a trace. A cursed word carved on a tree. Perfect for a night of telling ghost stories. Tonight we are going to do something a little different with it. We are going to turn the lights up, take the candles away, and look at what actually happened. Because the true story is stranger than the ghost story, and a great deal more human. Imagine sailing back to your own colony after 3 years away and finding it gone. The houses carried off, the people with them, and one word left waiting on a post. How does a whole town and its people disappear? Was that word a warning to turn back, or were they telling you exactly where to follow? And what happened to the baby girl born here just before you left? We'll get to all of it soon. But before we set out, if these slow journeys through history help carry you off to sleep, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel, and we will be here to do this for you again, every single night. And if you'd like, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is there as you settle in. However you found your way here tonight, I'm glad you came. Now, dim the lights, pull the blanket up, tuck your feet in where it's warm. And let's go back to the year 1587, to a low green island at the edge of a brand new world. To understand how 117 people ended up alone on that island, you have to start with a queen, a rivalry, and a man who was better with a paintbrush than a sword. In 1587, England was a small, ambitious country with a large problem named Spain. Spain had reached the New World first. Spanish ships were sailing home heavy with silver, and the Spanish king was spending that silver on the biggest navy in the world. England wanted in, not out of pure curiosity, out of survival, and a healthy interest in other people's silver. Queen Elizabeth I could not afford to build a colony out of her own treasury, so she did what monarchs have always done when they want something expensive without paying for it. She let someone else take the risk. That someone was Sir Walter Raleigh, courtier, adventurer, and a man with the sort of confidence that earns you either a statue or a beheading. In the end, he got both. Raleigh was given a royal charter to claim land in America for England, but he never set foot there himself. He was more of an ideas man. The man who actually went, more than once, was named John White. And here is the first thing that makes this story different from the grim, armored expeditions you might be picturing. John White was an artist, a painter. On earlier voyages, he had sailed this same coast and made watercolors, careful, astonishingly accurate paintings of the land and of the native people who already lived there. He painted their villages, their canoes, the fishing weirs they built in the rivers, the way they cooked and farmed and danced. 400 years later, those paintings are still the clearest window we have into that world. John White did not arrive on the coast of Carolina as a conqueror. He came, at least at first, as a man trying to see the place properly. In 1587, Raleigh put White in charge of a new kind of settlement. Not a fort packed with soldiers. England had tried exactly that on this same island 2 years earlier, and it had gone badly. This time, it was families. Men, women, and children. Farmers, a few craftsmen, 2 wives who were already pregnant. 117 people in all, according to the National Park Service. They were not raiding. They were moving in. They packed tools and seeds and cooking pots and all the heavy, hopeful clutter of people who fully intend to stay. Their plan was to settle further north, around the Chesapeake Bay, where the water was deeper and the harbors were better. Roanoke Island was only supposed to be a stop along the way, a place to collect a small handful of Englishmen left behind by the earlier expedition, say hello, and keep sailing north. It did not work out that way, though. When the ships reached Roanoke, the colonists got the bad news that they were not going any further. For reasons they could not control, the fleet would carry them no closer to the Chesapeake. Roanoke was not the doorway to their new home. Roanoke was the home now, ready or not. So they made the best of a place that was never meant to be theirs. And it is worth slowing down to picture where they actually were, because Roanoke is nothing like the easy green farmland the word colony tends to suggest. This is the Outer Banks of North Carolina, a long, thin chain of sandy barrier islands strung along the coast like a loose thread. Low dunes, salt grass, twisted little forests bent flat by the wind off the sea. Behind the islands lie wide, shallow sounds. Between the islands and the open ocean lie sandbars that shift in the night and tear the bottoms out of ships. Fresh water is hard to find. In places you have to dig down into the sand of the dunes to reach any at all. It is a beautiful place, and a difficult one. And in 1587, it was a very long way from anyone who could help you. Into that place, the colonists unpacked their lives. From the first day, there was work, and plenty of it. They rebuilt and repaired the houses the earlier expedition had left behind, patching roofs and walls against the wind that came off the sea and never quite stopped. They cleared and worked the thin, sandy ground and put in what crops they could. There was wood to gather, meals to cook over open fires, nets and lines to work along the shallows, and the slow, constant business of turning a rough camp into something like a home. 2 of the women were far along in pregnancy, carrying children in a place with no doctor and no midwife but one another, and no help of any kind within 1,000 miles of salt water. There were small children, too, learning to walk on sand instead of on English grass. It was a full and demanding life, lived from first light, by people who had crossed an ocean and now had to wring a living out of a coast they barely knew. And about 2 weeks after they arrived, on the 18th of August, 1587, a woman named Eleanor Dare, John White's own daughter, gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Virginia. Virginia Dare was the first English child born in this part of the New World. And from this night on, I want you to keep her in the back of your mind, because she is our clock. Hold on to her birthday, the 18th of August. We are going to come back to it, and when we do, it is going to matter. because almost as soon as Virginia was born, the colony ran straight into the problem that would shape everything that came after. They simply did not have enough supplies to last the year. 117 people on a sandbar, with winter on the way, and not enough food in the stores. Someone was going to have to sail all the way back to England and return with more. And the obvious person, the one with the standing, the contacts, and the trust on both sides of the ocean, was the governor himself, John White. White did not want to go. He had just become a grandfather 9 days earlier. Leaving meant crossing the Atlantic twice over and leaving his daughter and his newborn granddaughter on an island at the very edge of the map. But the colonists pressed him hard. If anyone could make certain the supply ships actually came back, it was the man whose name was on the charter. So, on the 27th of August, 1587, barely a week after Virginia was born, John White got back on a ship and sailed east toward England, promising to return as fast as wind and weather would let him. He had no way of knowing how long it would actually be before he made it back to the colony. Here is where the ocean stops being a road and turns into a wall. White reached England, and he set about organizing a relief voyage at once. And the timing could not have been worse. Because in 1588, England and Spain went to war. The big one, the one with the Armada, the enormous Spanish invasion fleet that came sailing up the English Channel to put an end to Elizabeth's reign. When your whole country is bracing to be invaded, the Queen needs every ship she owns. A little rescue mission to a sandbar on the far side of the Atlantic drops straight to the bottom of the list. Ships were held back for the war, and White's plans went nowhere. He kept trying anyway. He scraped together what he could, more than once, and more than once it came to nothing. Turned back by war, by weather, by crews who were far more interested in chasing Spanish treasure than in delivering flour to a stranded colony. Year after year, the sailing season opened and then closed again, and he was still on the wrong side of the sea. Somewhere across that ocean, White's daughter and granddaughter were living a whole life he could not see. If all was well, Virginia learned to crawl, and then to stand, and then to walk. And her grandfather was 3,000 miles of salt water away, stuck in a country at war, watching every sailing season slip past without him. He was not careless. He was not a man who abandoned his family. He was a grandfather doing everything a grandfather could possibly do, while a war he had no part in kept every ship he needed tied up in port. By the time John White finally got a ship turned back toward Roanoke, the year was 1590. Virginia Dare, if she was alive, was no longer a baby. She was about to turn 3. White's ship reached the Outer Banks in August of 1590, almost exactly 3 years after he had sailed away. As it happened, he came back right around the 18th of August, right around Virginia's 3rd birthday. I told you we would come back to that date. Here we are. Getting ashore was an ordeal in itself. As the ship came in toward the island, the men aboard saw smoke rising from the trees. To a man who had crossed an ocean carrying nothing but hope, smoke meant fire, and fire meant people, and people meant his family might still be alive a short row away. They steered for it. But the water in the Sounds is shallow and unforgiving, and the weather turned. One of the small boats they were using to cross from the ship to the shore overturned in the rough water near the beach. 7 men drowned within sight of the island they had come to rescue. White and the rest pressed on anyway, not because they were brave, but because his daughter and his granddaughter might be just past the tree line, and what else does a man do? By the time they finally got ashore, the light was going. White and his men climbed up toward the settlement in the last of the day, and here he did something that tells you everything about what was in his chest. He had a trumpet sounded, a long, clear English trumpet call into the trees, and when nothing came back, the men began to sing. Familiar English songs, the tunes from home, sung at full voice into the dark woods, so that any colonist who heard them would know that these were friends coming up the path, not raiders. They sang to the forest. No voice answered them. In the morning, White walked into the settlement, and what he found was not a battlefield. This matters, so hold on to it. There were no bodies, there was no blood, no sign of a struggle, no burned ruins. Instead, there was something stranger. The houses were gone, not burned where they stood, but taken carefully apart and carried away board by board. Around the spot where the settlement had been, the colonists had built a high wall of whole tree trunks, a palisade, the kind of thing you build slowly and on purpose, not in a panic. Heavy iron and lead goods lay scattered in the grass and going to rust, the things too heavy to carry. And when White went to the place where 3 years earlier he had buried his own chests for safekeeping, his books, his maps, his pictures, his armor, he found that they had been dug up, not by his colonists, it seemed, but by someone after them. His books were ruined. His armor was eaten through with rust. His careful paintings of that coast lay spoiled in the wet sand. It was the strangest kind of scene. Not violent, not bloody, just empty and tidy and deliberate. Wherever the 117 had gone, they do not seem to have been dragged. They seem to have packed. And then White saw the carving on the post. Before John White had sailed away 3 years earlier, he and the colonists had agreed on a plan, a simple one. If they ever had to leave Roanoke and move somewhere else, they would carve the name of the place they were going into a tree or a post, so that White would know where to follow. And they added one more rule on top of it. If they were ever driven out by force, by attack, by hunger, by some disaster, they would carve a cross above the name. The cross was the distress signal. The cross meant something went wrong. So White, walking through that empty, dismantled settlement, was not just looking at the wreckage of his hopes. He was reading. He was looking for a message he had helped design. And he found it. First, on a tree near the entrance, 3 letters cut into the bark, C-R-O. And then, on one of the great posts of the palisade, at the height of a man's eye, carved clean and clear in full capital letters, Croatoan. Now, to us, 400 years later and raised on ghost stories, that word lands like a curse. But to John White, standing right there, it was nothing of the kind. Croatoan was not a riddle. Croatoan was a place. It was a real island to the south, what we now call Hatteras, and it was home to a real people, the Croatoan, who were friendly to the colonists and whose leader, a man named Manteo, had actually sailed to England and back and was an ally. White read that word and understood it exactly as it was meant. We have gone to Croatoan. Follow us there. And here is the detail that should settle something in your chest before you sleep. There was no cross. White looked and looked again, and found none carved anywhere. By the rule he had set himself, that meant the colonists had not fled in terror. They had not been burned out or driven off. They had left on their own terms, in their own time, calmly enough to take their houses apart and build a wall and carve a clear forwarding address into a post. The most famous word in this entire mystery was never a scream. It was a note left for a grandfather. Gone to Croatoan. Come find us. Before we go any further, we should slow down and meet the people whose name was carved on that post. For 400 years, the Croatoan have mostly been treated as the answer to an English riddle, a spooky word, a place a colony disappeared into. But they were not a word. They were a nation of living people, and they had been on that coast for a very long time before any English ship came over the horizon. The Croatoan were one of the coastal Algonquian peoples of what is now North Carolina. They lived on the barrier islands and along the sounds, in towns, real towns, with houses built on frames of bent saplings and covered with bark and woven mats, set among worked fields and trees. They grew corn, beans, and squash. They fished the shallow sounds with nets and with long fences of stakes built out into the water, called weirs, that funneled the fish into one place. They made dugout canoes by burning and scraping out the trunks of big trees, and they took those canoes across water the English found frightening as easily as you or I would walk down a familiar street. They made pottery and beads of shell and copper, and they traded up and down the coast along routes that were old before England knew this land was here. We even know what their world looked like because we have pictures. Remember John White, the painter, from the start of our story? On his earlier voyage in 1585, before he was ever a governor, White sat down in these towns and painted the people in front of him. A man fishing, a woman holding her child, a whole village laid out with its houses and its fields and its cooking fires, a dance, a shared meal. He painted them as people going about an ordinary day. Those watercolors survive, and they are the closest, truest look we have at this world, made by someone who actually stood there and watched. So when you picture the Croatoan tonight, picture White's paintings. Not a costume, not a shadow at the edge of a ghost story, but families living a full life on a coast they knew better than anyone alive. That 1585 voyage is also where the two worlds first really met, and it is worth knowing how that went, because it was not all friendly. The English had come to this coast a couple of years before the Lost Colony. That earlier settlement we mentioned, the one full of soldiers. And the soldiers did what unsupplied soldiers far from home have a long habit of doing. They leaned hard on the local people for food. Tempers frayed, and before it was over, there was violence. And there were deaths. By 1587, some of the nearby nations had very good reasons not to trust an Englishman at all. So the friendships that did survive were not a given. They were rare, and they were worth a great deal. And the steadiest of them was with the Croatoan. A great deal of that came down to one man. His name was Manteo. Manteo was a Croatoan man from the very island the colonists would later name on that post. And some years before the Lost Colony ever set sail, Manteo did something that almost no one on that coast had ever done. He boarded an English ship and crossed the whole Atlantic Ocean to England. He walked through London. He met the people there, he learned their language, and then he sailed all the way back home again. By the time the 1587 families arrived, Manteo could move between two worlds. He spoke English, he understood the English, and he was trusted on both sides. He was the bridge between them. So hold that in your mind, because it changes the shape of everything that comes next. When those colonists were stranded and running low on food, the people whose name they cut into that post were not strangers, and they were not a horror waiting in the dark. They were neighbors, and in a place where the English had already made enemies, they were the neighbors who had stayed friends. They had towns and food and boats and a deep knowledge of how to live on that coast. And in Manteo, they had a man who already stood with one foot in each world. Gone to Croatoan was not a step into the unknown. It was a walk toward the people best placed to take them in. Which brings us back to John White, standing in that emptied settlement with the carved word in front of him. He had read it correctly. His people had gone to friends, not into the dark, and to find them he only had to follow them south to Croatoan. But the ships he had crossed on were not his to command. The only way White had managed to get back across the Atlantic in 1590 was aboard a pair of privateering vessels, whose crews were really out hunting Spanish treasure ships and treated the rescue of a stranded colony as a side errand, something to tolerate, not a cause of their own. And so he decided to follow the word. Croatoan was south of him. Hatteras Island, a sail down the coast, and that was where it pointed. White and the crew agreed to set sail in the morning and steer for Croatoan to find the colonists. After 3 years, after the 7 men drowned in the surf, after the ruined camp, he was finally one short voyage away from his daughter and his granddaughter. He never got there. That night, the weather turned hard against them. A storm came up off the coast, the same kind of weather that makes these waters so deadly, and it battered the ships through the dark. Anchors were lost. Cables snapped. By the time it eased, the vessels were damaged, the fresh water was running low, and the food was nearly gone. The crew had had enough. Treasure, not rescue, was what had brought them across, and they would not risk the ships any longer for one more try at a sandbar. They overruled the governor. Instead of turning south toward Croatoan, they turned the bows east, out toward open water, meaning to resupply and come back another season. They did not come back. The ships carried John White away from that coast for the last time. He crossed the Atlantic once more, the wrong way, and he never set foot in America again. He spent his last years far from all of it, on an estate in Ireland, an old man writing down what he had seen. As far as we know, he died there, around the year 1593. And he died not knowing. He never learned whether his daughter Eleanor was alive. He never learned what became of little Virginia, the granddaughter whose 3rd birthday he had sailed back to share. He had crossed an ocean for her and come within a single island of the answer. And the sea turned him around and kept it from him for the rest of his life. That carved word was the last of them he would ever have. Gone to Croatoan. He believed it. He simply never got to follow it home. So let's deal, right here, with the version of this story you have probably been told. Because between that carved post in 1590 and you lying in bed tonight, 4 centuries of people have gotten hold of this tale and dressed it up in a bedsheet. Start with the most common line of all, that the colonists vanished without a trace. It is a wonderful phrase, and it is simply not true. They did not vanish, and they did not leave no trace. They left a dismantled settlement, a deliberately built wall, 2 separate carvings naming exactly where they were headed, and a pointed absence of any distress signal. That is not without a trace. That is one of the clearest forwarding notices anyone has ever left behind. The mystery was never that there was no clue. The mystery is what happened after they followed it. Then there is the word itself, Croatoan, treated as if it were some dark incantation. A curse, a demon's name, a supernatural message. It was not. We just covered this. It was the name of an island and the people who lived on it, written down by a man who recognized it instantly. Spooky packaging, added centuries later by people who liked the chill of it. Underneath the packaging is a place on a map. You may also hear about the Dare stones. In the 1930s, a stone turned up near a river in North Carolina, carved with what claimed to be a message from Eleanor Dare herself, Virginia's mother, telling the sad fate of the colony. And then, after a reward was offered, more stones appeared. Many more. Over 40 of them, eventually. And here is the trouble. That flood of later stones was exposed as a hoax, carved by people chasing the reward money. As for the very first stone, the one found before the reward, historians still argue about it, and it remains disputed. Not proven real, not cleanly proven fake. We name the Dare stones. We call the bulk of them what they are, a hoax, and we set the rest aside as unsettled. We do not build the ending of our story on a rock that cannot hold the weight. And finally, there is the legend of the white-doe, a later folk tale in which Virginia Dare grows up among the native people, is transformed by magic into a white deer, and is killed by a silver arrow. It is a lovely, sad piece of coastal folklore. It is also exactly that, folklore, invented long afterward. It is not a record of what happened to the real child born on that island. We can enjoy it as a campfire story and still keep it well away from the evidence. With the ghosts cleared off the porch, we can finally ask the real question. Not what cursed them. Just this. 117 people left a note saying they had gone to Croatoan. So where did they actually end up, and what became of them? There are several possible answers to that question, and none of them is proven. But they are not all equally strong. So let me lay them out in order, beginning with the one the evidence leans toward hardest. The first and strongest is the simplest one. They did what their own carving said they did. They went to Croatoan, to Hatteras Island, and they went to live among the Croatoan people. Think about their situation. They were short on food, abandoned by their supply ships, facing another winter on a thin strip of sand. And a day's travel away were people they already knew, who already farmed and fished these waters and knew how to live here, and whose leader had been to England and was their friend. For hungry, stranded families, that is not a horror story. That is the obvious, sensible thing to do. You go to the neighbors who can keep you alive. And the ground itself has started to back this up. In recent years, archaeologists digging on Hatteras Island, where Croatoan once stood, have pulled late 16th century European objects out of the earth, mixed right in with the native settlement. A piece of a sword hilt, a writing slate and a lead pencil, the tools of literate English people, a fragment of fine German pottery, a small bronze counting token from the city of Nuremberg, a ring. These are not the sort of things that wash up by accident. They are the everyday possessions of English colonists, found in the homes of the Croatoan people, in exactly the place the carved post pointed to. The most likely reading is the gentlest one, that some of the lost colonists really did go to Hatteras and were taken in, and over the years became part of that community, married into it, raised children in it, and disappeared from English history, not because they died, but because they became someone else's family. The second theory does not contradict the first. It sits right beside it. It is the idea that the colonists split up and that some of them moved inland, away from the coast. We actually have White's own words for this. He wrote that before he left, the colonists had talked about moving 50 miles into the main, 50 miles inland into the interior. And there are clues out that way too. Modern researchers re-examined one of John White's own maps and found, hidden beneath a patch of paper glued onto it, a small drawing of a fort marking a spot well inland near the rivers. Digs in that area have turned up 16th century English pottery as well, the kind of household goods that suggest a small group of English people living there, at least for a while. It is not the whole colony, and it does not tell us how their story ended, but it fits a picture where the 117 did not stay one single group, but broke into smaller parties and went where each could survive. So the two strongest answers both point the same direction, and it is not toward a curse. It is toward people scattering, on purpose, toward places they could live. There are two darker possibilities, and we should weigh them plainly for what they are. The first is that some of the colonists were killed or captured. Years later, when the English finally founded a colony that lasted, Jamestown, further north in Virginia, settlers there heard reports. Rumors of people inland who dressed or lived like Europeans. And other rumors, grimmer ones, that a powerful local leader had killed a group of these strangers. The trouble with all of it is that these are later stories collected years after the fact, second and third hand, by people who had every reason to repeat a dramatic tale. They are not eyewitness records of 1590. Could some of the colonists, especially a small splinter group cut off from allies, have come to a bad end through hunger, sickness, or conflict? Yes, some could have. But could have is the whole of it. There is no solid proof that the colony was massacred, and the lurid version of that story usually leans on those dare stones we already set aside. The second dark possibility is the loneliest one. When White searched the empty settlement, he noted that the colonists' small boats were gone, which leaves open a lonely, sad thought that at some point some of them tried to sail, maybe down the coast, maybe in desperation out toward the open Atlantic and England itself, in boats far too small for that ocean. If anyone tried that, the sea would have taken them, and there would be no carving, no artifact, no trace at all. We have nothing that shows this actually happened. It is the most speculative idea in the whole story, a possibility we can name, not a fact we can stand on. But the missing boats leave the door open just a crack, and so we mention it, and then we let it be. 4 roads, then, leading out of that empty settlement. Live with the Croatoan, scatter inland, come to harm, or sail away and be lost. None of them is proven, but they are not evenly matched, and when you set them side by side, 3 of the 4 are thin, and one of them is supported by tools in the ground. So where does that leave us, lying here in the dark 400 years downstream? It leaves us with a record that simply runs out. We cannot tell you, for certain, what became of all 117 of them. We cannot tell you what happened to Eleanor Dare, or to her husband Ananias, or to the little girl whose birthday we have been carrying this whole way. Virginia, who would have turned 3 the very week her grandfather came back to an empty island and a carved post. That part is true. Some doors in history stay shut. But we don't know everything is not the same as they vanished into nothing. When you clear away the curses and the cursed stones and the white deer, and you look at what is actually in the ground and in the records, the weight of the evidence points one way, and it is the most human way of all. These were not people swallowed by a spell. They were families who ran out of help and made a hard, sensible choice. They took their houses apart, they wrote down where they were going, and they walked toward the people most likely to keep them alive through the winter. The strongest clues we have, the carved word, the sword hilt, and the writing slate in a Croatoan village, the English pottery inland, all point not toward an ending, but toward a beginning somewhere else. Not death in the dark. A new life, in a new community, under a new name, fading out of one people's story by becoming part of another's. And there is something worth keeping about that. We tend to want our mysteries to end with a body or a villain. This one most likely ends with a meal shared, a roof offered, and children growing up on Hatteras Island who carried a little English and a lot of Croatoan in them, and never thought of themselves as lost at all. They only got that name from the people who couldn't find them. Today, if you stand on Hatteras Island, there is no palisade and no carved post. There is sand and seagrass, and the same wide, shallow water the colonists once looked out over. Underneath it, every so often, somebody's spade turns up a 400-year-old token, or a bead, or a piece of a blade. Small, stubborn proof that English and Croatoan lives were once tangled together right there, on that beach, in a way the legend never made room for. That is where we will leave them tonight. Not in horror, and not without a trace, but on a sandy island at the edge of a new world, choosing to live. So let the questions settle. Let the island go dark behind you. The lights are already low. The blanket is warm. Your feet are tucked in. There is nothing left for you to solve tonight. Let it all go quiet and let yourself drift off, and we will be here to do this for you again tomorrow night. Sleep well. Under a low hill in southern Turkey stands a ring of carved stone pillars. Each one is taller than a person and weighs several tons, cut from solid limestone, stood upright in a great circle and covered in carved animals, foxes, snakes, vultures, wild cattle. They were raised around 11,500 years ago, which makes them older than Stonehenge and older than the Egyptian pyramids by thousands of years. They are the oldest monumental architecture ever found anywhere on Earth. And the people who built them had no metal, no pottery, no writing, no wheel, and no farms. They were hunter-gatherers, living by hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants. And with nothing but stone tools and their own hands, they quarried these pillars, carved them, stood them upright, used the place for centuries, and then deliberately buried the whole thing. That single fact, enormous monuments built before farming, broke 100 years of history books. It left a great many very serious archaeologists standing in a field, scratching their heads, because the order they had always taught for how civilization began had just turned out to be backwards. So let's ask the obvious things, the ones you'd ask if you walked up that hill yourself. Who were the people who raised these stones? How did anyone without metal tools cut and lift rock that heavy? What were the carved animals for? And why did they build something this enormous before they had so much as a single field of wheat? And then, after all that work, why did they bury it? We'll get to all of it soon. We have all night. But before we set out, if these slow journeys through history help carry you off to sleep, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. And we will be here to do this for you again every single night. And if you have a favorite theory about who built this place, by the end of tonight you'll have 4 good ones to choose from, so leave it down in the comments. We read them. So get comfortable. Turn the lights down low, pull the blanket up and tuck your feet in where it's warm. And let's go back, past every kingdom and every empire, past the pyramids, past the very first farm that was ever planted, to a bare ridge of pale stone 11,500 years ago, where a few hundred people are about to do something nobody on Earth has ever done before. The hill has a name. In the local language, it's Göbekli Tepe, which means, more or less, Potbelly Hill, named for its round, swollen shape, the way it bulges up out of the flat plain like a full stomach after a very large meal. For most of recorded history, that was the single most interesting fact about it, a funny-shaped hill with a funny-sounding name. In 1963, a survey team from 2 universities walked across the top of it. They saw some broken slabs of limestone poking up out of the dirt and a scatter of old flint lying around. And they made a note that there was probably an old graveyard up here, nothing that couldn't wait. Then they moved on. And you cannot really blame them. A graveyard is a perfectly reasonable thing to find on a hill. It is the kind of answer that lets everyone pack up and go home for dinner. So the most important archaeological site on the planet sat there for another 30 years, filed away under "had a look, nothing special." Then, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came to give it that second look. He had read the old survey notes, and where everyone before him had seen the tops of broken gravestones, something about the shape of those slabs would not leave him alone. So he climbed the hill. He looked at the stone, and he understood, more or less on the spot, that these were not gravestones at all. They were the very tops of enormous carved pillars, and the rest of each one was still down there, standing upright, buried up to the shoulders in the body of the hill. He is supposed to have said that he had two choices that day. He could turn around, walk back down, and say nothing to anyone. Or he could spend the rest of his life digging. He chose the digging. He ran the excavation for the next 20 years, and he never really stopped. When the first dates came back from the laboratory, they did the thing that good archaeology occasionally does, which is ruin everyone's afternoon. The stones were old. Not cathedral old. Not pyramid old. The oldest rings at Göbekli Tepe were raised around 9,500 years before the Common Era. Call it 11,500 years ago, give or take. Let me put that number somewhere you can actually feel it. Stonehenge, which most of us file under almost impossibly ancient, is about 5,000 years old. The Great Pyramid is about 4,500. Göbekli Tepe is roughly twice the age of either one. Put it this way. When the pyramids were going up, Göbekli Tepe had already been built, used, and buried for longer than the time that now separates us from those same pyramids. To the pharaohs, this place would already have been an ancient, half-forgotten thing, if they'd known about it at all. And here is the piece that rearranged the textbooks. For a very long time, the story of how civilization began went in a tidy order. First, people learned to farm. Farming gave them more food than they needed on the day. The spare food gave them spare time, and crowds, and villages. And only then, once they were settled and comfortable and sure of their next meal, did they get around to the grand, useless, beautiful things. The temples, the monuments, the carved art, the enormous symbolic projects you only attempt once your stomach is already full. Farming first, cathedrals later. That was the order, and for about 100 years more or less everyone agreed on it. Göbekli Tepe was built by people who had not invented farming yet. The monuments came first, and that single fact landed on the study of human history like a dropped plate. It sent archaeologists back to arguments they thought were settled, and it left a great many careful, credentialed people exactly where it leaves you right now, sitting up a little in the dark, asking how on earth that is possible. So who were they? The honest first answer sounds boring and turns out not to be boring at all. They were hunter-gatherers, not cavemen in the cartoon sense. No clubs, no dragging anyone around by the hair, none of that. These were people standing at the very end of the long age of hunting and gathering, right in the doorway of the settled farming world that was about to begin. They knew their land the way you know your own street. They knew where the wild gazelle moved with the seasons, and the wild boar, and the great herds of wild sheep. They knew which grasses came up heavy with grain you could grind into flour, and exactly when to go and cut them. They made fine, sharp tools out of flint and harder stone. They had fire and rope and baskets and dogs. The dog was the one animal that had thrown in with us by then, the first of all our animal partnerships, already curled up by the fire 11,500 years ago. And they had hands like yours, a back that got tired like yours, a head full of names and grudges and jokes that we are never, ever going to hear. That is worth holding on to as we go up the hill with them, because it is easy to talk about a place this old as if it were built by some different species. It wasn't. It was built by people, the same model of person you are, who would look at you lying there, warm under a blanket at the end of a long day and recognize you on sight. Now, what did they actually build? Picture a ring, a great oval room, 10, 15, 20 meters across, its wall made of rough stone and packed earth. Set into that wall, evenly spaced, standing upright all the way around, a series of carved pillars. And then, in the open center of the ring, 2 more pillars, taller than all the rest, standing on their own and facing each other across the empty middle. These are the famous stones, and they are shaped like a capital letter T, a tall, upright shaft with a broad slab laid across the top, like enormous stone tuning forks, or the world's heaviest doorways with no walls attached. The biggest of them stand well over 5 meters tall. That is taller than 3 people standing on each other's shoulders, cut from a single block of limestone, weighing many tons, hauled upright by hand. Archaeologists have given the best explored ring a plain name, Enclosure D, and it is the one that tends to stop people in their tracks. Because look closely at those 2 tall pillars in the center, and they are not just slabs. Down the sides there are arms, a pair of arms carved in low relief, bent at the elbow. Follow them around to the front, and the arms end in hands, long, careful fingers brought together over the place where a stomach would be, very nearly touching. There's a belt carved around the waist, and hanging from the belt, a kind of loincloth. These pillars are people, not portraits. The tops are blank. There are no faces, but bodies. Enormous, faceless, standing stone people, arranged in a ring, with 2 of them in the very heart of it, forever facing each other, hands almost meeting in the middle. Whoever they were meant to be, ancestors, guardians, gods, the honored dead, someone we have no word for at all. They have been standing in that exact pose, one carved hand reaching toward another carved hand, since before any human being had planted a field. Which brings us to the question you've probably been holding since the start. How? How did people with no metal at all make these? The pillars were quarried out of the limestone shelf that the hill itself sits on. To shape them, people took stone tools, flint and harder rock, and they pounded and scraped and pecked away at the limestone, hour after hour, day after day after day, turning a buried ridge of rock into a standing figure taller than a house. No iron chisels, no steel, no power of any kind except muscle and patience. And then they moved the finished pillars, each one weighing in the tons, with rope and baskets and wooden levers and ramps of piled earth and a very large number of human shoulders, all pulling in the same direction at the same moment, because there were no draft animals broken to the harness yet, and no wheel to put a cart on even if they'd had one. And that very large number of people is the honest puzzle, the one that has never really gone away. A job like this needs hundreds of workers, fed and organized and pulling together for a long time. But the usual picture of this period is of small, scattered bands of hunters who followed the herds and kept moving. So where did the crowd come from? Who fed all those people while they hauled rock instead of hunting dinner? Who decided where each fox and each snake would go and made sure everyone stuck to the plan? We genuinely do not know. That is the silence at the center of this whole place. It is a big, strange, human-shaped silence, and once people started noticing it, it did not stay politely inside the universities. It got out into the wide world. And when a mystery this big gets out, people come to it carrying answers, some careful, some wild, all of them trying to fill the very same gap. We're going to walk through every one of them tonight. But first, two things that might explain how all those people got fed: the animals on the walls and the feast. Start with the animals, because the pillars are covered in them. Carved creatures everywhere, in low relief across the stone. Foxes, a lot of foxes, lean and baring their teeth. Wild boar, tusks out, bristles up the spine. Snakes, sometimes dozens of them at once, pouring down a single pillar like water down a window. Scorpions, tall, long-legged birds, cranes and the like. Wild cattle, the great aurochs with the long, curved horns. And vultures, big, heavy, unmistakable vultures, wings spread wide. This was not a friendly mural of farm animals, because there were no farm animals yet. This is the real bestiary of their actual world, the things that could bite you, gore you, sting you, poison you, or turn up to eat you once something else had finished the job. And these people took the most dangerous, most frightening parts of their world, and they carved them by hand onto the walls of the most important building they had, one careful tap of a flint pick at a time. Fear turned into art with enormous patience by someone who had every reason to be afraid. One stone in particular has become famous enough to earn its own nickname. It's called Pillar 43, and people know it as the Vulture Stone. On it, there's a large vulture with one wing crooked outward, oddly, almost like an arm held up. Around it and above it, there's a scatter of other figures, more birds, a scorpion, and, set right by the vulture's bent wing, a single round disc. Hold on to that circle, because we are going to come back to it later tonight. Some people believe it is the single most important circle ever carved by a human being. But here is the honest, slightly maddening truth about all of it. We do not know what any of it means. Not really. We don't know whether the foxes were dangerous spirits or friendly ones, whether the snake's art stood for death or water or family, whether the vulture stone is a story, a calendar, a gravestone, or a doodle that happened to get famous. The people who could have told us have been gone for 11,500 years, and they left their pictures without a single word of caption. It is the strangest kind of intimacy, a whole language of images made by hands like ours, sitting right there in front of us, close enough to touch, too old to read. So what was this place? When the world first heard about Göbekli Tepe, it arrived with a headline already attached, and the headline was 3 words long: World's First Temple. And you can see exactly why it stuck. Giant stone figures, standing in rings, covered in sacred-looking animals, built by people who hadn't even settled down yet. Of course, it's a temple, the oldest holy place on earth. It is a wonderful, clean, magazine cover idea. But the people who actually dig there have spent the years since carefully taking that headline apart, because the longer they dig, the more ordinary life they keep finding mixed in among the giant stones. Hearths where cooking fires burned, old rubbish heaps, which are the single most reliable sign that human beings were living somewhere, for the simple reason that human beings produce garbage. Grinding stones by the thousand for crushing wild grain into meal. Heaps of flint debris, the leftovers of people sitting and making tools. Channels cut into the rock to catch and hold rainwater. This is not an empty temple that wandering nomads visited once a year and left spotless. People worked here and lived here, or right up against here. And that points at the warmest answer of the 3, the one I keep coming back to. Look at all that food being processed. Grinding stones everywhere, big stone troughs and vessels, mountains of animal bone, the remains of wild grain handled at a scale far past what a single family eats for dinner. A lot of researchers now think a big part of what drew those scattered people to the hill over and over, year after year, was a feast, a gathering. You come in from the herds and the wild fields, you meet the other bands you only see a few times a year. You eat together until you can't move. And while everyone is here and fed and in a good mood, you all put your backs into the next stretch of wall, the next pillar. That is one very human answer to who fed the crowd. They fed each other. The building and the feasting and the coming together were all the same act. So the careful archaeologists have traded the word temple for a more careful one. They call the big rings communal, gathering places, special buildings, yes, but built by and for a scattered people who came together here and, for a while, felt like one people, which is, if anything, a warmer idea than a temple. Not priests and a god so much as a crowd, and a fire, and a feast, and the most ambitious building project any of them had ever seen, going up a little more each time they met. And here the story splits. Because a place this old, this strange, this seemingly impossible, does not just sit on its hill being mysterious. People build theories on top of it, the way those first people built rings of stone. And over the last 30 years, 4 big ones have gone up. Some come from the careful folk with the trowels and the brushes. Some come from very late-night television. We are going to walk through all 4, give each one its best possible day in court, and then tell you, honestly, where the evidence really stands. Get comfortable. This is the part everybody argues about. The first theory comes from Klaus Schmidt himself, the archaeologist who spent the better part of 20 years digging the place up. So of the 4, it walks in with the best credentials. He argued it in his own books and papers, and it became the headline that carried Göbekli Tepe around the world. He liked to put it in 5 words. First came the temple, then the city. Here is what he meant, laid out properly. Everyone had always assumed farming came first, and the grand building came much later, once people were settled and fed and sure of the next meal. But the rings on this hill went up before farming, so Schmidt turned the question around. Instead of asking what these people could afford to build, he asked what the building itself might have done to them. And he proposed a mechanism, a chain of cause and effect that runs like this. Raising these rings took hundreds of people, gathered in one place, fed for weeks or months at a stretch, coming back season after season for generations. You cannot feed a standing crowd like that by hunting alone, because the herds keep moving and the wild harvest is scattered and brief. But the hills around Göbekli Tepe happened to be thick with the wild ancestors of wheat and barley, growing in dense natural stands. If you needed to keep the same crowd fed in the same spot, year on year, the natural thing to do is to start managing those wild grasses, protecting a patch, clearing it, scattering seed where you want it, coming back to harvest on purpose. Do that for enough generations, without anyone ever sitting down and deciding to invent agriculture. And you have invented agriculture. And this corner of the world is, in fact, one of the places where farming really did first take hold. So in Schmidt's telling, the gathering came first, and farming grew up around it as the way to keep the gathering fed. The temple did not wait for the harvest. The harvest was invented to serve the temple. It is a genuinely beautiful idea, and you can feel why it electrified people when he first said it out loud, that the very first thing our species settled down for was not bread, but meaning, and the bread came along afterward to keep the meaning fed. So where does that idea stand today? Softer than it did when Schmidt first lit it up. The same years of digging that turned up all those hearths and grinding stones and rubbish heaps also complicated his clean, dramatic story. The more they find, the less it looks like a lonely temple raised by pure wandering nomads who happened to invent farming on the side, and the more it looks like a place where people were already part settled, already halfway into the new world, gathering and feasting and building and edging toward farming all at the same time. So religion-built civilization has cooled into something more tangled and more honest. That worship and settling down and farming all came up together, braided over centuries, and we are still working out which strand pulled which. Less of a thunderclap. And to a lot of people, including me, more interesting, because it means nobody planned it. It just grew. The second theory is the one that put Göbekli Tepe on 100 magazine covers and a great deal of television. And it starts with that round disc we set aside, the one carved beside the vulture's wing on Pillar 43. It comes from 2 researchers at the University of Edinburgh, an engineer named Sweatman and his colleague Tsikritsis, who published a paper arguing that the vulture stone is not decoration at all. It is, they say, a message, a date written in animals. Here is how their reading works. They treat the carved creatures on Pillar 43 as symbols for groups of stars, the way we draw a scorpion for the constellation Scorpius or a bull for Taurus. Read that way, they argue. The particular arrangement of animals on the stone matches the night sky as it would have looked at one specific moment, a moment they calculate, from the slow wobble of the stars across the ages at around 11,000 years before the Common Era. And that date, they point out, lands right on top of something real. Around then, the Earth was passing through the torrid meteor stream, a wide band of comet debris. Our planet still crosses twice a year. And around then, the climate took a sudden, savage turn back toward the cold, the long freeze the scientists call the Younger Dryas. So Sweatman and his colleague proposed that the vulture stone records a comet strike, a swarm of fragments coming down out of the torrids, remembered and carved by the survivors as both a date and a warning. The round disc beside the vulture, in their reading, is the comet itself. And you can feel why it caught fire, because it is so specific. It is not a vague, ancient people were wise. It is a date, a named meteor stream, and a climate disaster in the geological record that all seem to line up. When the pieces click together like that, it stops feeling like a guess and starts feeling like a code somebody finally cracked. So here is where it sits, and the honest note comes, as it so often does, from the people who actually dig the hill. Two of the lead archaeologists, Jens Notroff and Oliver Dietrich, published a direct reply to the Comet paper, with the rather pointed title, "More Than a Vulture." Their objections were every bit as specific as the claim. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe, they pointed out, were not made in a single moment. They are spread across many pillars in many buildings, cut and recut over centuries. So reading one pillar as a snapshot of one night sky ignores how the whole place actually grew. The match between animals and constellations isn't fixed either. If you are free to choose which creatures count as stars and which patch of sky to lay them against, you can find very nearly any date you go looking for. And the famous disk carries no label telling us it is a comet. It could be the sun or the moon or one of the round objects that turn up elsewhere on the site, or something we simply have no word for. So it is not the accepted explanation. But, and this is exactly why it earns its airtime tonight, it is not a foolish idea either. And it is a wonderful thing to lie here in the dark and weigh for yourself whether or not Pillar 43 really is a calendar of catastrophe. The fact that we can stand in front of it 11,000 years later and argue the point in earnest is its own kind of marvel. The third theory is older as an idea than Göbekli Tepe is as a discovery, and its most famous living champion is the British writer Graham Hancock, who has argued it across a shelf of best-selling books and, more recently, in front of very large television audiences. Here is the case at full strength, because it deserves a fair hearing. During the last ice age, with so much of the world's water locked up in glaciers, the seas stood hundreds of feet lower than they do now, and vast stretches of coastline that today lie underwater were dry, fertile, livable land. Hancock proposes that somewhere out on those drowned coasts, a genuinely advanced culture grew up. Not spaceships and skyscrapers, but seafarers and astronomers and master builders, generations ahead of the scattered hunter-gatherers around them. Then, at the end of the Ice Age, in that same Younger Dryas window of catastrophe, the world turned over, rapid melting, seas climbing fast, great floods, perhaps comet strikes, drowning that culture's coastal heartland and scrubbing away almost every trace of it. The survivors, he argues, scattered inland and across the world, carrying what they knew, the building, the sky watching, the first seeds of farming, and they handed it to the simpler peoples they washed up among. And this is the point where Göbekli Tepe walks on stage. To Hancock, a site this sophisticated, this early, built by people the textbooks file under simple foragers, does not look like a beginning at all. It looks like an inheritance. The hunter-gatherers, in his telling, did not dream this up out of nothing. They were taught by the refugees of a lost world, and Göbekli Tepe is one of the first places that older knowledge breaks back up through the surface. He points to the planning, the precision, the astronomy people read into the carvings, and he asks the question that does a lot of work for him. Where is the apprenticeship? Where are the clumsy early tries, the failed first drafts? Why does this appear so suddenly and so accomplished? It is, as a story, genuinely gripping, and it pulls on a very old human ache, the dream of a golden age lost under the water, that we have spent the rest of history half remembering. And then you climb down into the dig and you look hard at what is actually in the ground. Flint blades, grinding stones, the butchered bones of wild gazelle and boar and aurochs, charcoal from old cooking fires, stone tools by the thousand, caught at every stage of being made. What you do not find is one single trace of the advanced teachers. No metal, no writing, no machinery, no fine goods carried in from a drowned homeland, nothing a local community with stone tools and a great deal of skill could not have made for themselves. And that missing apprenticeship Hancock asks about turns out to be there after all. It is just spread across the whole region, in the plainer, older sites and the everyday tools nearby that show people working their way up to this, step by patient step, exactly the way you would expect if they figured it out for themselves. So it is a captivating idea on very thin ground, worth turning over as you drift off tonight, but the stones keep insisting, chip by chip, that they were made by local hands, learning as they went. And the fourth theory is, by a wide margin, the most famous of all four, the one nearly everyone listening has heard some version of. It is the idea that Göbekli Tepe was raised with help from somewhere beyond the earth, ancient aliens. The theory has a proper name, the ancient astronaut hypothesis, and a founding father, a Swiss author named Erich von Däniken, whose book Chariots of the Gods sold in the tens of millions and planted one sticky idea in the popular mind. The idea is this, that the great wonders of the ancient world were simply too advanced for the people who supposedly built them, so those people must have had help from visitors who came down out of the sky. Göbekli Tepe, surfacing so old and so accomplished, became a natural new exhibit for that argument, and it has been a fixture of the late-night television version of history ever since. Let's give it its strongest form, because the question underneath it really is a fair one. Look at what the place demanded. Pillars weighing many tons, cut from solid rock, carved with fine detail, lifted and lined up with real care by people with no metal, no wheel, no draft animals, and no writing to carry the plans from one mind to the next. How, the proponents ask, Could Stone Age hunter-gatherers possibly have managed engineering on that scale? The precision looks too good, the scale too large, the date far too early. Something this far ahead of its time, they argue, needs an outside hand. And then they point straight at the stones themselves. Those tall central pillars, the ones with the long-fingered hands and the carved belts, are not ancestors or guardians at all, the proponents say. They are portraits of the visitors, towering, faceless beings set down in stone by the awestruck people they came to. The animals become the visitors' emblems. The whole ring becomes a monument to contact. And the early date, to them, is the clincher, the supposed smoking gun. How else, they ask, could people fresh out of the Ice Age read the heavens or move stone like this, unless someone from elsewhere had shown them how? Here is where it lands, and it is the same ground the lost civilization story came to rest on. Every single object ever lifted out of that hill is human and earthly. Every chip of worked flint, every animal bone, every tool, every mark on every pillar is exactly what you would expect from human hands. Stone tools, rope, earth ramps, and an enormous amount of patient time. There is no scrap of alien metal, no cut that human tools could not make, no material from off the planet, nothing at all that needs a visitor to explain it. And the famous impossibility is not really one. We know it can be done without metal because it was done, and the plainer, older sites scattered across the same region show, step by step, people building up the skill to do it. The honest answer to how could Stone Age people possibly have managed this turns out to be the least mysterious answer in the world. They were a great deal cleverer and a great deal more capable than we have ever given them credit for. And there is something a little sad in handing the achievement to the stars, because the moment you do, you take the single most astonishing thing human beings ever pulled off this early, and you hand the credit to somebody else. The truth is the better story. People did this. People who had not yet invented the wheel did this with their own hands by working together on a cold hill at the edge of the world. I would much rather lie here amazed by them than by anybody from another planet. So what became of it? After all of that, the quarrying, the carving, the hauling, the feasting, the rings of Göbekli Tepe were filled in, packed with rubble and earth and old bones, until the giant stone people were buried up to their shoulders once more, and the hill closed over the top of them. And the reason why is, you will not be surprised to hear by now, argued over. For a long time, the answer was that they did it on purpose, a deliberate burial, a careful covering over, for reasons of their own. Newer work suggests it may be messier than that. Slopes washing down, walls collapsing, buildings repaired and half buried and built over again across a long, slow life, until the earth finally took the whole thing. Not one dramatic ending, but a long biography that simply wound down. And here is the part that turns it from a sad story into a strange and wonderful one. That burial is the only reason you get to hear about this place at all. A ring of carved stone left standing out in the open weathers, down to nothing in a few thousand years. Rain and frost and wind blur the foxes, blunt the vultures, topple the pillars, but buried it kept. Sealed under that pot-bellied hill, the carvings stayed as crisp as the day they were cut, the snakes still pouring, the vulture's wing still raised, waiting in the dark for 11,500 years, until a man who had read an old survey note came up the slope to look twice. And it turns out it was never alone up there, either. Just a few miles off sits another site, Karahan Tepe, with carved pillars of its own and stranger carvings still being uncovered. And beyond that, a whole scattering of related sites across that corner of Turkey, which the people who study them have started calling the Taş Tepeler, the Stone Hills. Göbekli Tepe was not one miracle dropped onto an empty plain. It was the most famous building in a whole world of building, a wide community of people spread across a wide stretch of country, all reaching toward the same idea, with stone, at the same astonishing moment in the human story. Whatever moved them to do it, it moved a lot of them, across a lot of hills, for a very long time. There is a roof over it now, a wide modern shelter, a walkway that carries visitors out above the rings, a museum down the road in the city of Şanlıurfa, and a place on the official list of the most important sites in the world. You could go. It is a real spot, on a real map, open to anyone who makes the trip. The foxes are still there on the stone. The vulture is still there, wing still raised. And 11,500 years after a few hundred hunter-gatherers cut those figures out of the hill, you can stand at the railing, look one of those tall stone people in its blank, patient, faceless top, know almost nothing about why it was made, and feel anyway that somehow you recognize it. So let that be the last picture tonight. The rings of standing stones under their shelter, and in the middle of each circle, the two tall figures facing each other, the carved hand reaching toward the carved hand across the gap, long fingers nearly touching, the way they have nearly touched since before there were farms, or cities, or writing, or wheels. The people who made them are gone. Their names, their language, their gods, the meaning of every fox and snake and vulture, all of it has slipped too far back for us to follow. But the work is still here. The hands are gone. The thing the hands made remains, close enough to touch, too old to read. That is where we will leave it for tonight. The lights are low, the blanket is warm, your feet are tucked in. There is nothing left to do now but breathe slow and let yourself drift, while up on a pale ridge, 11,500 years ago, a few hundred people you will never meet finish raising a ring of stone, and the earth begins to close over it for the long, long wait until somebody comes back up the hill to find it again. Sleep well. We'll be right here tomorrow night with another one. Hello again, friends. Tonight we are going to lie back and drift more than 3,000 years into the past, to a world that was, in a lot of ways, the very first version of our own. A connected world. A world where a king in Egypt could send a gift up the coast to a king in Greece, where a single wooden ship might carry copper from the island of Cyprus, tin from somewhere far away to the east, and enough grain in its belly to feed a whole town for a season. And then, in the space of one ordinary human lifetime, about as long as you or I get, that entire connected world came apart. The great cities burned. The letters between kings stopped. And to this very night, after all our digging and all our arguing, nobody can tell you for certain why. So here are the questions we will carry with us into the dark. What was it actually like to be alive in the most connected world that human beings had ever built? And then to watch it quietly fall to pieces around you. Why did the great cities of the Bronze Age, Mycenae in Greece, Hattusa up in the mountains of what is now Turkey, the rich little port of Ugarit on the coast of Syria, why did they all burn down within a few short years of one another, and then sit empty, never to be rebuilt? Who were the mysterious raiders that the Egyptians carved onto their temple walls and simply called the peoples of the sea? And did they really bring down an entire age all by themselves, the way the story usually gets told? And when it was finally over, when the palaces were ash and the writing had stopped and the trading ships were gone, what, if anything, grew back? We'll get to all of it soon. But before we set out, if these slow journeys through history help carry you off to sleep, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. And we will be here to do this for you again every single night. And if you feel like it, leave a little note down in the comments and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I do love reading them, long after you've all drifted off. Now, go ahead and dim the lights. Pull the blanket up. Tuck your feet in. Because you are not going to be watching this world from a safe distance tonight. You're going to be standing right in the middle of it. So, you've just woken up, and it is roughly the year 1200 before the Common Era. Call it 3200 years ago. You are standing on a stone quay in a busy harbour on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea, and the morning is already warm. The water is that flat, hard blue. And in front of you is the thing I really want you to see. Because it is easy to picture the ancient world as a few lonely kingdoms sitting far apart, each one minding its own business. This was not that. This was a neighborhood. Out in the harbor, there are ships from half a dozen different kingdoms riding at anchor. There's a merchant haggling in one language and answering in another. There are clay jars, big ones, taller than a child, called pithoi, being rolled down a gangplank full of olive oil and wine. And stacked on the deck of one ship are these heavy, dull orange slabs of copper, each one shaped like an ox hide stretched out flat, with little handles at the corners so a strong man can sling one over his shoulder. That copper was dug out of the ground on the island of Cyprus. It is going to be melted together with tin, and the tin came from so far away that we are still not completely sure where. And the two of them together make bronze, the hardest, most useful metal anybody on Earth knows how to make. That is why we call this the Bronze Age. And that bronze is the whole reason this neighborhood exists. Here is the part that should feel familiar. All of these kingdoms, the Egyptians down south, the Hittites up in the mountains, the Mycenaean Greeks across the water, the merchant cities of the Levantine coast like Ugarit right here under your feet, they were all wired together into one enormous trading system. And historians have a slightly stiff name for how it worked. They call it a palace economy. That just means that in each city, the king's palace was the warehouse, the bank, and the boss of nearly everything. The grain came into the palace. The bronze got made under the palace's eye. The big trade deals were arranged, palace to palace, king to king, like one long letter-writing friendship between royal households who mostly never met in person. It worked beautifully. For about 300 years, it worked. Which, when you think about it, is a very long time. That's longer than the United States has existed. And the reason it worked is also, as we are about to find out, the reason it was in such terrible danger. Every kingdom needed the others. Egypt needed the trade. Greece needed the tin. Everybody needed everybody. So picture it one more time before we go on. The warm harbour, the foreign voices, the ox-hide slabs of copper going up the gangplank in the sun. A whole world leaning on a whole world. What on earth could knock all of that down at once? Well, if you have heard this story before, you have almost certainly heard one answer. And it is a great answer. It's dramatic, it's tidy, and it comes with pictures. The Sea Peoples did it. Here's where that comes from. Far to the south, in Egypt, a pharaoh named Ramesses III had a giant temple built, a place called Medinet Habu. And he had its walls covered, floor to ceiling, in carvings bragging about his victories. And among all the usual royal bragging, there is this run of carvings showing a great battle against an enemy that came, the inscriptions say, from out of the sea. And these enemies look like nobody else on the wall. They wear these tall, strange headdresses, rows of stiff feathers standing straight up, almost like a crown made of reeds. They come in ships, and the Egyptian scribes wrote down a kind of roll call of their names. The Palisade, the Shekelesh, the Sherden, the Denyen, and a few more. Names that, frankly, the Egyptians may have only half understood themselves. A French scholar in the 1800s bundled all these groups together under one catchy label, the Sea Peoples, and the name stuck. It stuck so hard that for a long time the whole story of the collapse was basically just a horde of mysterious sea raiders came howling out of nowhere, torched every city from Greece to Egypt, and ended the Bronze Age. Roll credits. And honestly, you can see why people love it. It's got a villain. It's got a horizon full of black sails. It's the movie trailer version of history, and the movie trailer version is always the one that's easiest to remember. There is just one small problem with it. When you actually go and look, city by burned city, the story falls apart almost completely. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the night where it would be easy to swing too far the other way and pretend the Sea Peoples didn't exist. They existed. The battles in Egypt really happened. People really did move across the sea in great numbers, and some of them really did fight. But a single fleet of raiders destroyed everything. That part just doesn't hold up. And here's the cleanest way to see it. Take Hattusa. That's the capital city of the Hittites, the mountain empire up in central Turkey. Hattusa was burned and abandoned right in the thick of all this. So you'd expect signs of a great sea battle, right? Except Hattusa sits hundreds of miles inland, up in the high country. No sea raider in a wooden boat was rowing up a mountain. Whatever happened to Hattusa, it was not a navy. And it goes further. When archaeologists dug into Hattusa, they found that before the city burned, it had already been emptied out. The storerooms had been cleared. The valuables were gone. That is not what a surprise attack looks like. That looks like people packing up and leaving on purpose, which is a very different and much sadder kind of ending. We'll come back to it. Then there's the matter of who the sea peoples even were. Remember that Egyptian carving, the one with the tall feathered headdresses? Look a little to the side of the warriors, and you find something that completely changes the mood of the whole scene. Ox carts. Big, slow, wooden ox carts, piled with belongings, and riding in them, women and children. You don't bring your kids and your furniture to a raid. You bring them when you are not raiding. You bring them when you are leaving home for good and you are never coming back. These were not just an army. A lot of them were refugees, whole families fleeing something, looking for somewhere, anywhere, that still had food and safety. They were running from the same disaster they're so often blamed for. So the monsters from over the water turn out to be, when you get close, mostly just frightened people in carts. Same as anyone would be, same as we would be. Which leaves us right back at the real question, the honest one. The one the carving on the wall can't answer for us. If it wasn't simply the raiders, then what was actually happening to this world? And here, the story splits into three. The first thing that was happening, and we can prove this one, which is lovely, is that it stopped raining. Not for a season, not for a bad year, for a very, very long time. Now, how could we possibly know how wet it was 3,000 years ago? This is one of my favorite tricks in all of science, so stay with me. Deep in caves, water drips from the ceiling for thousands of years and slowly builds up those stone icicles, stalactites, one mineral layer at a time, like rings in a tree. And the chemistry of each layer quietly records how much rain fell that year. Scientists drilled into the layers of a cave in what is now Israel, read them like a diary, and the diary says the same thing over and over for decade after decade after the year 1200. Dry, dry, drier. A drought that didn't break for generations. And you don't actually need the cave to tell you. The people there told us themselves. Remember those letters between kings? In the final batch of them, one word keeps surfacing. A word that just means hunger, famine. They write to each other about it plainly. Send grain. The people are starving. There is hunger in the land. Picture what that does to a palace economy. The whole system runs on the king's storerooms being full of grain. Empty the storerooms, and the king has nothing to pay his soldiers with, nothing to feed his craftsmen, nothing to trade. The drought didn't have to knock the walls down. It just had to empty the pantry. And this matters, because I don't want to leave you lying there picturing only the hunger. People are extraordinary at not dying. When the rain failed, families did the oldest thing in the world. They got up and they moved. Toward water, toward the coast, toward each other. Those ox carts we just talked about, that's this. That's people choosing against everything to keep their children alive and keep moving until they found a place that could feed them. The drought was cruel, but it didn't make people give up. It made them go looking. It just wasn't the only thing going wrong. Because at the same time, and this is the second thread, the ground itself would not hold still. This part of the world sits on a tangle of faults, the same ones that still rattle Turkey and Greece today. And some scientists, studying the ruins, noticed something strange. At site after site from this exact window of years, Mycenae, Troy, Hattusa, and more, they found the particular kind of wreckage that earthquakes leave. Walls fallen all in one direction, like a row of dominoes. Heavy stone blocks twisted off their bases. Skeletons caught under collapsed doorways. Two researchers gave it a wonderful, ominous name. They called it an earthquake storm. The idea being that when one big fault lets go, it can load up the next fault along, and the next, so that over 50 years or so, a whole region gets hammered by major quake after major quake, each one knocking on the door of the one beside it. Now, I have to be honest with you, the way this channel always tries to be. This one is a hypothesis, not a settled fact. The big paper that named the earthquake storm is about 25 years old now, and there are very smart people who think it's been overcooked. Now that we're blaming earthquakes for some damage that fire or war or simple abandonment actually did. So hold it the way the scholars do. Probably real. Probably part of it. Not the whole answer, and not proven. But here's the warm thing about earthquakes, and it's a true thing. People had felt the ground shake for as long as there had been people in those mountains. And every single time before this, they had done the same thing. They waited for it to stop. They cleared the rubble, and they built it back. Humans are almost stubbornly good at that. We rebuild. It's one of the most reliable things about us, which is what makes the next part such a genuine mystery. Because this time, for the first time in living memory, in city after city, they didn't rebuild. Why not? What was different this time? And that brings us to the third thread. The quiet one. The one I find the most haunting, precisely because it's the one that feels the most like us. Go back to that copper on the gangplank. To make bronze, you need two metals, copper and tin. The copper was close enough, Cyprus, just over the horizon. But the tin came from enormously far away, passed hand to hand along trade routes that stretched, we think, all the way to Central Asia. One single, fragile, ridiculously long supply line. So think about what a drought and earthquake-stricken world does to that line. A city in the middle of the route falls, so the traders won't risk the road. So the next city can't get tin, so it can't make bronze. So it has nothing valuable to trade for grain. So it gets hungrier and weaker, and then it falls too, and breaks the route for the city after it. Each kingdom was holding the hand of the next one in a long chain across the whole sea. And when a few of them let go, the ones still standing didn't just lose their neighbors. They lost the thing that had kept them alive. The bronze workshops, at site after site, simply go silent. The fires go cold. Nobody's making anything, because nobody can get the ingredients, because the people who used to bring them are gone. This is the answer to why didn't they rebuild? You can rebuild a wall after an earthquake. You cannot rebuild a wall when the entire world you traded with has stopped existing, and there's no one left to sell you the tools. And here's the part that gives me a chill in the nicest way. The thing that made this world so strong, the fact that everyone was connected to everyone, turned out to be the exact same thing that made it so easy to break. The more tightly you weave a net, the more places it has to tear. I don't say that to frighten anybody half asleep. I say it because there's something almost comforting in it once you sit with it. It means the people of the Bronze Age weren't foolish, and they weren't cursed. They had simply built something so connected, so clever, so much like our own world, that it had the same beautiful weakness ours does. We lean on each other. That's not the flaw. That's the whole point of having neighbors. It just means that when the hard years come, we come through them the same way they did, not alone. All right, we've laid out the three forces: the dry sky, the shaking ground, the broken web. Now let's go and stand inside two cities while it actually happens, quietly. We won't stay long. First, back up into the mountains, to Hattusa, the Hittite capital, with its great stone gateways carved into the shapes of lions. We already know how this one ends: the empty storerooms, the fire. But I want you to picture the choosing of it, because it's gentler than you'd think, and truer. By the end, the Hittite kings were running out of everything. The grain ships they begged for from Egypt weren't enough. The empire's edges had already pulled loose. And the last king whose name we have, a man called Suppiluliuma II, sat in a capital that the world was no longer feeding. And here, I have to stop and tell you something honest, because it's one of the loveliest kinds of not knowing in all of history. We do not know what happened to him. We don't know if he died in the city, or led his people out of it, or simply vanished from the record one ordinary afternoon. The last Hittite king walks out of the light of history, and we genuinely lose sight of him. Nobody gets to tell you the ending, because nobody wrote it down. That's not a gap to be frustrated by. That's just the edge of the map. But the city itself tells us the important part. Before Hattusa burned, the people of Hattusa took their treasures, their records, the things that mattered, and they left. This wasn't a massacre. As far as the stones can tell us, it was a decision. A whole population looked at a capital that could no longer keep them alive, and they chose to walk out of the mountains and go somewhere that could. And they didn't vanish. That's the thing to hold on to as you lie there. The Hittites scattered, yes. But down in the warmer lands to the south, their children and grandchildren built new little kingdoms, kept their old language, carved their old gods into new stone. We even have a name for them: the Neo-Hittites, the New Hittites. The empire ended. The people walked into a different morning, and some part of them carried on for centuries. So we leave Hattusa not in flames, but on the road. Travelers with everything they own, heading downhill toward food, toward the next thing. Which is, when you think about it, Not the saddest way for a story to go at all. Now come back down to the coast, back to that warm harbour where we started the night, to Ugarit. Of everything in this whole story, this is the part I think about most. Because of all the cities that fell, Ugarit left us something almost unbearably human. It left us its last words. Ugarit was a writing city. It was stuffed with scribes and clay tablets, a place where the king's letters were dictated, pressed into wet clay with a reed, and then baked hard in an oven so they'd keep. And when the archaeologists finally dug Ugarit out of the ground, they found a batch of these tablets right where the heat had caught them. Some of them, it seems, still sitting in the kiln, in the very act of being fired on the last day. And you can read the city's final months in them, letter by letter, like watching a tide come in. The early ones are ordinary worry. Trade is slow. Send grain, there's hunger. Then they tighten. There are ships off the coast we don't recognize. Then tighter still. The enemy has burned our towns. And then there is one letter, the one that stops your heart a little, from the king of Ugarit, a man named Amurapi, writing to the king of Cyprus across the water. And he says, more or less, the enemy's ships are here. They have already burned my cities and done terrible things in my country. My own ships are away, off in your waters. My foot soldiers are away, up in the Hittite lands. The country is undefended. Please, send help. We do not think that letter was ever sent. It was found still in Ugarit, in the ruins, in the ash. The help it asked for was never coming, and the man who wrote it almost certainly knew. And then the writing stops, mid-tide, and Ugarit goes quiet for 3,000 years. Now, I told you, every hard thing tonight lands somewhere warm, and I meant it, and here is where this one lands. Listen. That letter survived. The fire that destroyed the city is the exact same fire that baked Amurapi's clay hard enough to last 3,000 years and reach us tonight. The disaster preserved the very cry for help it answered. And so the help did finally arrive. Not the soldiers he wanted, but us. We came. We dug him out. We read his words. We know his name. A king begged into the dark and was sure no one would ever hear him. And here we are, all of us, all over the world, hearing him all these centuries later as we fall asleep. And the coast he loved didn't die either. Just up the shore from Ugarit were her cousin cities, Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, and those, as we're about to see, did not merely survive. They were about to do something that changed the entire human race, including, in a way you won't believe, this very sentence. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, just let Ugarit rest. Its last words were heard. That's all any of us really want. And then, for a while, there isn't much to tell. And that's the point. After the cities fell, the world that came next was a quieter one, smaller. The grand palaces weren't rebuilt. The long trade routes stayed broken. And in Greece especially, something happened that almost never happens in history. People stopped writing. The Greeks had a writing system before the collapse, and afterward they simply lost it and didn't have writing again for something like 400 years. Historians have a name for the centuries that followed. In Greece, they call them the Dark Ages, not because they were evil, but because the lights of record go out and we mostly can't see in. The towns got smaller. There were fewer people. Life got more local, more handmade, closer to the bone. I won't pretend that wasn't hard. For the people living through the first part of it, it surely was. But I don't want you to picture it as the end of anything, because it wasn't. It's better to picture it the way you might picture a deep winter, or the deepest part of the night, this very part, right now. Not a death, a rest, a long, quiet stretch where the world wasn't producing much and wasn't recording much and was, underneath all that quiet, slowly getting ready to begin again. Because here's the question that turns the whole night around, and it's the one I most want you to drift off wondering about. When a world ends this completely, what gets to grow in the space it leaves behind? As it turns out, almost everything we are. Let's start with who kept the lights on, because somebody did. Down in Egypt, Ramesses III, the pharaoh with the bragging temple walls, actually did hold the line. The Sea Peoples came at Egypt twice, and twice Egypt threw them back. Now, Egypt came out of it poorer and weaker, smaller in the world than it had been, and it never quite got its old swagger back. But it did not fall. It kept its kings, its temples, its language, its everyday life. Of all the great Bronze Age powers, Egypt is the one that walked through the fire and came out the other side still standing. Egyptian civilization would carry on, in one form or another, for more than 1,000 years after this night. And out east, away from the worst of it, other lights stayed on too. The kingdoms of Mesopotamia, Assyria up north, Babylon down south, were bruised, but they endured. The disaster had fallen hardest on the western, sea-facing edge of this world, the part most dependent on all that long-distance trade. The older inland powers, a little more self-sufficient, a little more able to feed themselves, rode it out. So, if you're lying there worried for this whole world, don't be. The map didn't go dark. It dimmed. There were always lamps still burning, somewhere warm, where children were still being born, and bread was still being baked, and somebody was still telling stories at night. The same things you and I do. The world is very hard to end completely. It turns out it's much easier to change it. And oh, did it change? Here is the first gift the disaster left behind, and it's a strange and wonderful one. Remember the whole problem with bronze, that it needed tin from the other side of the world, carried along a supply line that the collapse had snapped? Well, when you can't get the metal you're used to, you go looking for one closer to home. And there was another metal, sitting in the ground almost everywhere, that people had mostly ignored because it was harder to work and bronze was doing just fine. Iron. Iron is fussier to make. You have to get your fire hotter, and you have to know a few tricks. But iron ore is common as dirt, because it more or less is dirt. And once people were forced to figure it out, they discovered that iron, done right, is stronger than bronze. Better tools, better blades, better plows for the very farming that feeds everyone. And here's the quietly beautiful part. Bronze had always been, a little bit, a rich world's metal, because only the kings, with their long-distance trade, could get the ingredients. But iron you could dig and smelt close to home, without a king's trade network at all. So the knowledge spread, and it spread wide into the hands of ordinary people in ordinary places. The collapse, completely by accident, took the most important technology in the world out of the palace's hands and gave it to everybody. We don't even call what came next the Late Bronze Age anymore. We call it the Iron Age, a whole new chapter of the human story, named after the gift that the disaster shook loose. The old world had to break before that could happen. But it happened. And now what I promised you, back in the harbour at Ugarit, the piece of this story that reaches all the way forward and touches you, right now, tonight, more directly than anything else we've talked about. Remember Ugarit's cousin cities up the coast? Byblos, Tyre, Sidon? After the collapse, with the old palace-run trade gone and the sea routes wide open and unguarded, those coastal cities did something brilliant. They became the new traders of the whole Mediterranean. We call them the Phoenicians. For centuries, they sailed everywhere, carried everything, and stitched the broken world back together with their little merchant ships, doing, as free traders, exactly the job the dead palaces used to do. But moving that much trade to that many places, in that many languages, you need a way of writing things down that anyone can learn fast. Not hundreds of complicated picture symbols that take a trained scribe half a lifetime to master. Something simpler, something a busy merchant could actually use. So the Phoenicians carried and spread a small, brilliant kit of letters, a couple dozen simple marks, one for each sound, an alphabet. And they carried it to Greece, and the Greeks took it, added a few letters of their own for their vowels, and made it theirs. And the Romans took it from the Greeks and made it theirs. And that Roman alphabet is the one that marched across Europe and, eventually, across the whole world. Friends, the letters I'm using to tell you this story tonight, the A, the B, the C, every single one of them is a great-great-grandchild of the letters those Phoenician traders carried out of the wreckage of the Bronze Age. The shapes have wandered and changed over 3,000 years, but the line is unbroken. The alphabet that is, right now, this very moment, carrying these words into your ears and easing you towards sleep, exists because of what a handful of survivors did after their world ended. The collapse didn't just take things away. It handed the entire future the pen it would write itself with. And the last thing to grow, in that long quiet, was a way of thinking about the world that we have never really put down. Those Greek Dark Ages, the 4 silent centuries, the time of fewer people and no writing, they did, eventually, end. The Greeks came back out into the light, and when they did, they were carrying that new alphabet, and they used it to write down stories that had been told aloud, around fires, all through the dark, including 2 enormous poems about a war and a long voyage home by a poet we call Homer. Stories that, it turns out, are the half-remembered echoes of this very Bronze Age world we've spent the night in. The Greeks were, in their poems, dreaming about the lost world that came before them, about this one. And out of those reawakened Greeks came the rest of it. The first plays, the first written history, the first time a group of ordinary citizens governed themselves and gave the idea a name: democracy. The questions about how to live and what is true and what is good that we are somehow still asking. None of that, none of it, comes if the Bronze Age doesn't end. The classical world we draw so much of ourselves from could only be built in the space that the collapse cleared. The old, tightly wound, palace-run world had to come apart so that a freer, wider, more written-down one could grow up in the gap. That's the thought I want to tuck you in with. Not loss, transformation. The world you woke up in tonight didn't survive, but it didn't really die either. It became us. So, let's come all the way back. Did we solve it? No. And I'd be lying to you if I said we had. The honest truth is the one we started with. Nobody knows for certain why the Bronze Age fell. The dry sky, the shaking ground, the broken trade, the families on the move, every one of those was real, and they all arrived at the same terrible time, on a world too tied together to shrug any of them off. The mystery is genuine. It's allowed to stay a mystery. That's part of what makes it worth visiting. But the shape of it, underneath the mystery, is kind. A world that looked a great deal like ours leaned hard on itself, and the hard years came, and it came apart, and then people did what people always do. They got up. They moved toward each other. They figured out iron. They carried letters across the water. They told stories in the dark until the lights came back on. And here is where you are right now. You are not on that quay. The harbor is 3,000 years quiet. The drought broke an age ago, and the ground beneath your bed is still. You are here, in your own warm and ordinary night, safe, with the blanket pulled up and your feet tucked in. And the very alphabet that drifted out of that long-ago wreckage is the one that just carried this whole story home to you. The world ended once, completely, and turned into ours, which means it's a great deal sturdier than it ever looks from the inside. So you can let all of it go now and rest. Sleep well, friends. We'll be here to do this for you again tomorrow night.